Welcome back everyone. In today's episode of Wuthering Heights, a reader's guide, we're going to be looking at the way that Emily Bronté tells her story. Wuthering Heights has a very complex structure, and it leaves lots of ambiguity in terms of what we can and cannot know about the story and the characters. How much of what we hear is actually true? Are Catherine and Heathcliff really the monsters that Nellie Dean makes them out to be? Can we trust Nellie Dean herself as a narrator? And what about Lockwood, the guy who gives us the framing of the whole story? These are the kinds of questions that we're going to be answering in this video. In part 1, I'm going to look at the general narrative structure of Wuthering Heights. Then in parts 2 and 3, I want to look more closely at our two main narrators, Nellie Dean and Lockwood, and determine how reliable they are as narrators. In part 4, I'll look at two other narrators who have small narrative points, Catherine and Isabella, and then in the final part of the video, I'll try and work out which of these, if any of them, are actually reliable narrators. Part 1. The narrative of Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights is bookended by a framing narrative which is told from the perspective of Mr. Lockwood. Lockwood arrives at the beginning of the story as a tenant of Thrushcross Grange, and basically the story begins with him going to Wuthering Heights, seeing Heathcliff and the people that live in that house, and then wanting to know more about the history of these very strange people. When he returns from his trip from Wuthering Heights, where he has a pretty hard time of it, he meets Nellie Dean, or at least talks to Nellie Dean, his housekeeper at Thrushcross Grange, and she tells him that she knows quite a lot about Heathcliff's life and backstory, and so she begins to tell him the story of Heathcliff and Catherine and everybody else. Nellie's narrative is definitely the main narrative in the story, but it's important to remember that even Nellie's narrative is embedded in Lockwood's narrative, because he's the one who's writing all of this down in the book. And to make things even more complicated, within Nellie's narrative, there are more embedded narratives from other characters like Catherine and Heathcliff and Isabella, and even at one point a minor character called Zillah. So why does Bronté use so many different narrative voices? Aside from just being very confusing and maybe even convoluted if you are not a fan of the book, what value does this provide to us as readers? In my view, having multiple narrators allows Bronté to do two things. The first thing it allows Bronté to do is in some ways give us a more objective story than we would have got if we just got Wuthering Heights told from the perspective of one character like Nellie. And the second thing that it allows Bronté to do is show us that by giving us all these different perspectives and the stories told from different perspectives, it shows us how much of any story is just a subjective experience. You can't really get a true objective story. I think one of the reasons why having multiple narrators allows us as readers to get a more objective picture of what is going on is because when you have multiple narrators telling the story in different ways, you can notice inconsistencies between what these characters are saying as well as consistencies with what they're saying. And so when there are inconsistencies, you can say to yourself, okay, well maybe we shouldn't trust this picture that's being painted here. But when there's corroboration between narrators, you kind of get a sense of, okay, well this at least has a bit more weight to it. Whereas if you just have one narrator, you just have to take everything that they say on trust, unless maybe they contradict themselves. Two examples of corroboration in the story that come to my mind are when Lockwood finds Catherine's diary in her bedroom. This diary details some of the abuse that she and Heathcliff suffered as children, and later on this gets corroborated by Nellie in her own narrative. Although, as we'll see, Nellie does tweak that story a little bit. Another example of corroboration is between Nellie's depiction of Heathcliff's character when he's older and much more vengeful and cruel, and this then being corroborated in Isabella's letter, where Isabella tells Nellie how terrible Heathcliff is being as a husband. So ultimately, having lots of narrators does allow us as readers to get to a more objective picture, because we're able to kind of determine what's truth, what's corroborated, what isn't, and that gives us more insight into what's actually going on. At the same time though, having these various narrators also makes us aware of how much a story told through the eyes of a person is going to be biased. As we'll see, not just in this episode, but in future episodes, all of the characters in Wuthering Heights have their own interpretation and take on things. They all have a different idea about who is the victim and who is the abuser, and having multiple narrators allows Bronté to really get that message across. Ultimately, Bronté is saying that any story that you hear from someone is going to be filtered through that person's interpretation of things. And so you can never take one story as a fully accurate picture of reality. Part 2. Lockwood, the reader in the story. When Lockwood first appears in Wuthering Heights, he is the typical outsider type of narrator. He's not from these parts, he's coming in from the city, and he is observing all of this crazy stuff happening at Wuthering Heights, and then he's listening to Nellie's story. As a character, he also in many ways to me represents what the typical reader of Wuthering Heights might have been at the time. He's reasonably well educated, he's male, he is a bit judgmental, and he certainly doesn't know much about country life and the life of the working class. I think there are many other parallels as well between Lockwood and the reader, both the reader at the time and also just the reader in general. When Lockwood first arrives at Wuthering Heights, that's also when we as readers arrive at Wuthering Heights, and his experiences of the Heights are very much our experiences. I think at first there is an impulse to kind of go along with Lockwood's judgments about the people at Wuthering Heights. We might actually think that Heathcliff is quite a capital fellow, as Lockwood calls him, and we might be maybe disdainful of characters like Joseph and Hareton, and even Catherine, who comes across as very violent and cruel in those opening parts. Because at this point we don't know the backstories of these characters. All we have is Lockwood's judgment of them, and Lockwood's judgment, as we'll see, is pretty bad. He's not a very good judge of character. And in many ways I think that is supposed to reflect how the audience or the reader will feel about the characters going into the story. Now it's quite common when you have a first-person narrator story for the first-person narrator to be sort of outside of the story, either because they're not from round these parts like Lockwood, or just they're the sort of character who's more likely to sit back and observe things and not really get involved in the plot in any substantial way. In fact, sometimes authors who use this device can isolate their narrator so far from the plot that they almost become non-characters in themselves. But Lockwood's narrator, while he initially seems to be one of these outsider types, soon becomes embedded in the narrative, and as much as he might like to think himself detached from this whole story, he's very much a part of it. Right at the beginning of the story, at Wuthering Heights, he is the one who sees Cathy's ghost. And it seems that this isn't something that's happened before, so this is quite a significant event within the story. Later on, as he starts to hear Nellie telling the story of young Cathy, he starts to get feelings for young Cathy. And he even seems to play a role in bringing young Cathy and Hareton together. Ultimately, the character who begins as an outsider becomes very much a part of the story and part of some of its main events. I think this journey of Lockwood's from outsider to a part of the story itself again mirrors that of readers. When you open the book, you don't know much about this world, you see yourself as outside of it, but as you get further into a text, as you learn more about the story and the characters, you become invested in those characters, and in a way you start to form relationships with them. Obviously, you can't go as far as Lockwood in actually involving yourself in the plot itself, but as readers you certainly do develop an affinity for certain characters or a hatred of certain characters, and you do begin to form judgments and a feeling of the things that are going on. Ultimately, I think that through the character of Lockwood, Bronté is able to show us that there really is no true outsider. Whether you're the outsider narrator type who thinks they're outside of the story that they're telling, you're actually not. You're a part of the story, you're there, and you're having influence on it. And likewise, as a reader, you might think that you're outside the story and you can just kind of pass objective judgment on things, but that's also not possible. The more you read the story, the more you become embedded in the story, and so you can't just take this outsider view. Everyone is involved in the story that they're telling and also the stories that they're hearing. Part 3. Nellie Dean and Zillah. Two sides of the same judgmental coin. So Nellie Dean is the primary narrator of the story. She gives us the history of the Earnshaws, Lintons and Heathcliffs, and then when Lockwood leaves and comes back, she fills in Lockwood on what's gone on in the interim. Like Lockwood, Nellie has a similar sort of outsider status. She's not quite a member of the Earnshaw family, she's a servant, but she's also seen as a foster sister. And as the novel progresses, her association and involvement in the plot becomes, in fact, a lot bigger than she sometimes gives it credit for. Some people argue that Nellie is one of the driving forces of most of the key events in the story, so while she might perceive herself as an outsider who's watching all of this crazy stuff going on and passing judgment on it, actually, she's one of the most important figures in the story and causes some of its most significant events and tragedies. Although I do think Nellie has some claim to being an outsider, I don't think she's playing quite the same role that Lockwood plays. For me, Lockwood is very much a representation of the reader, and to some extent he's more outside of things than Nellie is. I think through the character of Nellie, Bronté is able to communicate to us that there really is no objective way to tell a story. Even Nellie herself is pretty open about being biased against certain characters like Catherine, who she openly admits, "I own I did not like her." And so we should always be wary of the things that Nellie says, especially when Nellie is describing what she thinks are people's motivations. I don't think Nellie as a narrator ever really lies about the things that happen, but I do think she often reads certain people in very uncharitable ways, especially Catherine Earnshaw, who, she admits that she does not like this person. Another thing that Nellie does as a narrator is play down her involvement in some of the big events of the story. And for me, probably the worst offending time that she does this is when she plays down how involved she is in Catherine's death. So in the story, Edgar banishes Catherine from ever seeing Heathcliff again. And in response to this, Catherine decides to lock herself up in her room and basically starve herself, not quite to death, but almost to death, for several days. Now, when she actually comes out of her room and she's clearly sick and saying, I'm not well, help me, tell someone, Nellie doesn't actually do anything. She doesn't believe that Catherine is actually that ill. She thinks that it's all just for show and nothing else. Mrs. Linton, on the third day, unbarred her door, and having finished the water in her pitcher and decanter, desired a renewed supply and a basin of gruel, for she believed she was dying. That I set down as a speech for Edgar's ears. I believed no such thing, so I kept it to myself and brought her some tea and dry toast. Now, because Nellie doesn't believe Catherine is sick, this results in Catherine's sickness accelerating. Now, I do think it would definitely be a stretch to say that Nellie kills Catherine or anything that dramatic. Catherine certainly brings a lot of this stuff on herself, but you can't deny that Nellie doesn't have a hand in that death and that she does play it down. So when you're reading the story, look out for these moments where Nellie will do certain things that actually have pretty significant consequences, but as a narrator she'll try and gloss them over as she's trying to claim this outsider status. I should point out though that although Nellie is a biased narrator and though she downplays her involvement in the story, I don't think she is a terrible liar or anything like that. I think she is generally honest, and she's even quite open and frank about her biases, which suggests that she's not necessarily consciously trying to mislead Lockwood or the reader in the story that she's telling. And there's also evidence of Catherine from other sources being quite cruel and malicious and also manipulative, so to say that Catherine isn't those things, it would also be a little bit too extreme. Ultimately, I think that Nellie is just like all the other characters in the story, incredibly flawed and biased, and therefore as a narrator she's also flawed and biased. Before we wrap up this section, I also want to commentate on a little parallel that I saw, which I find to be quite funny and also revealing, between Nellie and the other maid character, Zillah. Now, Zillah is a character who works at Wuthering Heights for Heathcliff for a while, and at one point in the story, Nellie meets up with Zillah. I think she meets her in town, and Zillah tells her what's been going on at Wuthering Heights with Heathcliff. What's funny about this is that these two characters are very similar to each other, but Nellie doesn't see this and she doesn't like Zillah at all. And when Nellie tells Lockwood about Zillah and her narration, she goes on to say things like this. Zillah has told me something of the way they go on, otherwise I should hardly know who was dead and who was living. She thinks Cathy haughty and does not like her. I can guess by her talk. My young lady, Cathy, asked some aid of her when she first came, but Mr. Heathcliff told Zillah to follow her own business and let his daughter-in-law look after herself, and Zillah willingly acquiesced, being a narrow-minded, selfish woman. What's funny about this is that Nellie could basically just be describing herself here rather than Zillah. Nellie thought that Catherine Earnshaw, the old Catherine, was haughty and cruel and mean, and likewise it seems like Zillah has the same interpretation of the young Cathy. I also don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that Nellie is a little bit narrow-minded and even selfish at times. So I just found it really funny that there's this parallel between these two narrators, and I think this was a deliberate move by Bronté to show us how biased Nellie is, and also maybe how unself-aware she is. She thinks that she's not like this at all, but actually she's very similar to Zillah. She doesn't like Catherine, she interprets her uncharitably, and Zillah does the same. Part 4. Isabella and Catherine. Nellie and Lockwood are our main narrators, but in this section I want to consider some smaller narrative passages from Isabella Linton and from Catherine Earnshaw herself. Isabella has two forms of narration. One is in a letter that gets reproduced to Lockwood, and so it's exactly Isabella's words, and the second narration that she has is through an extended dialogue that she has with Nellie, that Nellie is then recounting to Lockwood at a later date, and so that might be a little bit less reliable. Catherine's main narrative part is in a diary entry that she wrote with a child, and this is something that Lockwood finds, so like Isabella's letter, it's a very direct form of narration. Isabella's letter is important for a few reasons. Firstly, because it corroborates how violent and cruel Heathcliff has become at this point in the story, but also because it allows us to see firsthand what's been going on at Wuthering Heights while the story has been focusing on Thrushcross Grange, because that's where Nellie is at this point. This is important because the narration is not biased through Nellie this time. It comes directly from Isabella. It also allows us to know what it's really like to suffer under Heathcliff. Nellie as a character never really experiences direct violence from Heathcliff. In fact, Heathcliff seems to like Nellie to some extent, and Nellie seems to not necessarily like Heathcliff, but be somewhat sympathetic towards him. With Isabella's character, at least by the time she's writing this letter, most of that sympathy, if not all of it, is gone, and so we get a really stark picture of just how cruel Heathcliff has become. In my view, I also think that Isabella might be one of the most objective narrators. Isabella's character arc is one where she begins by loving Heathcliff, she falls in love with him and she marries him, and so she has seen the good in him to some extent. And then she marries him and then she suffers abuse at his hands, and so she's been on both sides of the coins. She's experienced Heathcliff's best and his worst, and so I think in this letter she is giving a true account of what's going on. Or at least she's giving a more true account than maybe Nellie would. Now on to Catherine's diary. Catherine's diary is very important because, first of all, it corroborates some of the abuse that she and Heathcliff suffer under Hindley's hands, but more importantly, it's the only part of the book where we actually get something from Catherine's mouth herself, or at least her hand and her pen. Without this diary entry, we would only really have Nellie's account of Catherine to go on, and as we've seen, Nellie is not the most reliable person when it comes to Catherine. In the diary entry, Catherine is telling the reader how she and Heathcliff are suffering abuse, and the picture that we get presented to us here is not of a cruel, manipulative person, but a young girl who's suffering and is sad for her friend who is also suffering. In this diary entry, Catherine comes across as human and sympathetic, and I think without this diary entry, it would be really easy to just dehumanize Catherine as a character and not empathize with her at all. It also adds an element of tragedy, because Catherine, like most of the characters in Wuthering Heights, will grow up to be quite a horrible person. And so having this early passage and having this moment where you see her in her childhood innocence, if you like, just gives you an extra layer of sympathy for the character that you just wouldn't have if it wasn't there. Another thing that's quite important in the diary entry is that Catherine points out that Heathcliff was crying, and this is an important thing because Nellie's narration tries to present Heathcliff as this completely, emotionally void person, and the picture that Catherine presents does contradict that a little bit. So I do think that this diary entry is very important and something that you should definitely read carefully and use it to think about and empathise with Catherine and Heathcliff, because it's probably one of the most trustworthy sources of information about them when they're children. When Nellie's recounting the story, I don't think she's really thinking all that much about Catherine and Heathcliff as kids. She's thinking about where they've gone in life, and they went to some pretty dark places, and I think that means that she projects this back into their childhoods and makes them out to be a lot less sympathetic than they otherwise might be. And of course, this echoes the main theme of the whole narration and the whole having lots of narrations thing, which is that no story is fully objective, and so you need to read everything from everyone's perspective in order to try and understand what really went on. Part 5. Who can we trust? So of these narrators, which one is the most reliable? Well, I think to answer that question would be to kind of miss the point here. All of the characters in Wuthering Heights who get a chance to narrate are biased to some extent. The most visible here is obviously Nellie, because she has the most narration, but this is true of all the other narrators as well. They're all biased by their feelings, by their relationships, and by their background. And there's no getting around this. There is no one single objective narrator. When looking for objectivity in the world of Wuthering Heights, all you can do is look at the various narrations that we get, the different voices, see if there are things that are corroborated, see if there are things that don't come out as consistent, and then make a judgment for yourself. For some people, Wuthering Heights could just be a story in which Catherine and Heathcliff were horrible from the start. For other people, they could be victims of circumstance. The subjectivity in the narrative allows for this broad interpretation, which is why I think the book is so interesting and why it's great to reread it and go back and think about all of these things. So ultimately then, there really isn't a true reliable narrator in the story. But I'm not saying that they're all liars either. People just have their biases, people have the things that they remember, the events that are significant to them, and those are the things that they're going to focus on when telling a story. What's great about Wuthering Heights is we get a few different narrators, and so that allows us to piece together what went on a little bit more objectively than we could if it was just told by one person. But ultimately, you're never going to know, and that's why you have to reread it and talk about it and try and understand what's going on. Okay, that's it for this video. What do you think about the structure of Wuthering Heights? Do you find it convoluted and annoying, or do you think that actually it has some very interesting things to say and makes for a very ambiguous and interesting story? If you enjoyed the video, give it a like and subscribe to the channel for updates. In next week's episode of Wuthering Heights, a Reader's Guide, we're going to be looking at the theme of love in the story and asking the question, is Wuthering Heights a love story, or is it a story about abuse? But until then, I look forward to discussing this episode with you in the comments below. Take care everyone, I'll see you all next time.